think one of the things I like about my job is community building, and I call talent scouting and idea brokering and those types of things. And he just went through my background, but I have a wide variety of, I guess, tools in my kit bag, so to speak. I mean, I've done everything from being a serialist to a product vendor to being a circuit librarian in a 5-county region in North Carolina servicing medical libraries and community health centers, to starting digitization programs. I was a federal grant officer. I gave money away, which is a real fun thing to do. But I think the job I really like best right now is being a community builder. Because I really do believe this, it is a great time to be a librarian. And I think the reason why is because, you know, I know this is not the way Michael Stipe intended this line, but it is the end of the world as we know it. And I feel fine because with all this churn and all of the change that's happening in librarianship, there is so much opportunity and so much potential and so many ways that we can reinvent ourselves that the door's wide open. And I love this quote by T. Scott Pluchak. I mean, he talks about this being the very threshold or beginning of the digital age, the incunabula of the digital age, so to speak, and that we are at this beginning. So, you know, this is something that's said a lot about the network changes everything. And if you have, I also give reading lists to people when I give talks, and I do have a citation list at the end of this, but there are a couple things I snuck in here at 4 o'clock in the morning that aren't on the reading list. Well, if you haven't read this book by Lee Rainey and Bill Wellman, I think it's really worth your time. It's called The Network, How the Network Changes Everything, and they really go into the social dynamics, how we share things, and how being in a networked world really changes the way we present ourselves. It allows us to be parts of multiple communities at the same time. We can present different faces and have different associations. The network also allows us to leverage local expertise to a broader scale. I mean, I think a really good example was, you know, the work that Declan and Mike was doing with Curate Camp. You know, it's 2 guys with an idea. So it's 2 guys with an idea and then working with somebody that brings the network effect that becomes actually a national opportunity for folks. It amplifies that local excellence. So if you have people that have, you know, a really great deep expertise, we had a cataloger in opera performance. I mean, I'm sure you have people in your libraries that have these amazing, and what I want to say, enthusiastic, amateur knowledge about this thin line of subjects. And what if you can amplify that for the use of the broader community? And I know there are people that would find me and say, oh, Lila, the cataloger with opera performance. We wait until we see her record shows up in OCLC and we grab it. And I'm like, that's awesome. But the thing about the network also changes the way we deliver library services. And I think it starts pixelating out or distributing out, where before we were really bringing everything in and felt that we had to be responsible for delivering all these different service layers in the library. Now with the network, we can rely on a variety of different partners. I mean, we talk about Dropbox for preservation and, you know, putting our applications up in the cloud and those types of things. And it really makes it a distributed network of our library. And Lorcan Dempsey goes through and discusses this concept, and he's been doing it since 2005. He always retweets me in a recent citation when he does another talk, and this is the most recent one, which is really good. It's on SlideShare, called Right Scaling Engagement and Learning, Reconfiguring the Library for a Networked Environment. It was done on April 19th, 2013. I'm not going to go through these concepts very deeply, but definitely go and read that. I think it really brings you a different perspective on how we think about libraries. So that's, suffice it to say, it's not business as usual. And there's definitely been the conversation, and the conversations I've been involved with, about how everything is local. It's when we're talking about linked data, and we talked about linked data being a series of relationships as opposed to, you know, records. You know, when we think about our special collections, or things we like to say hidden collections, the things that are in our back room that we haven't processed, the cataloging things. I think in a linked data world and in a networked world, those hidden collections, those things that are unique and special to our institution, actually start having higher priority, because there are certain relationships that can only be expressed through processing and having intellectual control of those collections. Does that make sense? So I think those priorities start to shift a little bit. And this is a concept that Dorothea Salo talks a lot. Before, libraries were bringing information in, bringing the world into their communities, and now we're starting to bring that unique content that's generated from our communities out to the world. And it's a different way of thinking about collection development. It's a different way of thinking about our systems and our priorities and how we organize ourselves in the library. And sometimes people call this the flipped library. And I don't like this term because I totally regress to being 13 years old. And I think of this. So I'm just going to go back for a minute. And the reason why I think of that, I like Johnny. He's a good guy. I think there's an object lesson here, and I'm just going to kind of take a break from Flip Library for a second and talk a little bit about one of my heroes, Johnny Cash. And, Johnny Cash was a very famous, well-renowned country music singer. And, this picture was taken in 1969 at Folsom Prison, and it was a photo for the prison ward. And, he had a lot of success, and he was very, well-known and well-loved in the country music world. But in 1987, the world started shifting around Johnny. There was the new country music. There was these new artists, and his sound wasn't what people wanted to hear. His producer wanted him to change his sound and what he did. His music label ultimately dropped him. His producer dropped him. He was basically unemployed in the late 80s. And then in the early 90s, people started picking him up. U2 had him on a Europa album. And this is when Rick Rubin came around and said, hey, would you like to record on Def Jam Records? Or it's now Def Rock Records. And Rick Rubin had his reputation in rap. Okay, here's Johnny Cash, a country guy, talking to Rick Rubin, a rap guy. But he knew who he was. And the thing about Rick Rubin was that he said, you don't have to compromise on who you are. And Johnny Cash, if anything, definitely knew who he was. When you look at his career, he had a sound, he had a vision, he had a persona, and he stayed true to who he was. And I think that was very important when he transitioned to this new space, because he ultimately was much more successful with the American recordings. And he reached a whole new audience, and he extended his relevance beyond a natural term life for a recording artist. In fact, this ad showed up after he recorded the second album in the American series called Unchained. And I was living in Nashville at the time, and I remember driving down Music Row, and it was after the Grammys, where he won a Grammy for Best Country Album. That was never played on country radio. That was not on a country label. That was not embraced by his peers in Nashville. And this billboard was at the beginning of Music Row, which is where all the studios are. And I don't know if you can read the caption in the back, but it said "As Big as Life." I remember driving down the road, and it says, "Thank you. I want to acknowledge the Nashville music establishment and country radio for all your support." So, you're sitting there driving, you're like, ah! But, so what I'm trying to say here is that I love bringing up Johnny Cash anyway again. There's a lot going on in libraries and also higher education and in our communities. And it's this disruptive effect. And the world isn't like it was 5, 10, 20 years ago when I started library school. And I think it's really easy to get lost or sometimes feel anxious about what we do, and sometimes maybe we settle for the solution or the answer that gives us immediate relief instead of thinking of what it means in terms of the health and the wellness of our profession. Because I see a lot now that folks are forgetting why they're in librarianship. I think we talk sometimes about the library does this and libraries, and I'm like, the building, the last time I checked, was not something that can make decisions. It's the people in the building that makes the decisions. It's the librarians. And I really think we need to get reacquainted with the mission of librarianship. And This is something that David Lankus talks a lot about. I know he's been at Access way back. But he actually just recently taught a massive online class, MOOC, I hate that word, just this summer. And David's one of these people that has my utmost admiration just because he was struggling with cancer, and he's still, bald head, no eyebrows, teaching a MOOC to over 1,000 people about new librarianship. That's how passionate he feels about this. And I think Nick kind of touched on this when he talked about the group in Toronto about having this social responsibility. I think we need to really reconnect to this idea that the reason why we do our jobs is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in the communities we serve, and it goes on to say through unfettered access to information. Okay. So there's a lot of you can't read that conversation around concepts around open and leadership and community. We talk about these things a lot, and I think there's a lot of there's a lot of facets to these concepts, and I think there's a lot of distraction that happens when we don't remember who we are in our mission. So I want to first talk about the concept of open and kind of unpack this a little bit for us this morning. Always we're like, yeah, open, and then it's like, kinda, maybe, sorta. The first aspect of open I want to talk about is just about our metadata. I mean, we heard a lot this week about linked open data, and somebody was talking about sharing metadata in things like Oyster and OCLC. Metadata, there's a recent conversation about, is metadata copyrightable? And I'm definitely firmly in the camp of no. I think it's, we should free up our metadata as much as possible because it's what facilitates knowledge creation in our community when people can find our stuff. We need to have that information in the places where people look for things. It might not be our library catalog. It's going to be other places. So we need to make sure that our metadata is freed up and is licensed, whether it's a CC0 or it's thrown out with public domain, in a machine-readable way. And there's a real recent conversation that just happened at Berkeley. Karen Coyle did a nice blog post about it, and I recommend you go reading it, to kind of go through, I guess, the arguments around intellectual property rights and metadata. You can talk for probably 90 minutes on that, and I am not. But I firmly believe that our cultural heritage organizations need to release their metadata. This is, to me, is like a non-starter. This argument has come and gone, and we need to move on. Kind of ripping off intellectual property on collections, I'm going to talk a little bit about collections as data. Because I think open not only applies to intellectual property, copyright, et cetera. I think sometimes we lock down our content when we digitize it in ways that we're not even cognizant of. And I know I was guilty of this at one point when I worked at the University of Richmond, and we just started digitizing newspapers. What I mean is we were going through round and round with my digital librarian at the time. We were digitizing newspapers from the Civil War era in the United States, which was around 1850. They're very difficult because they're jam-packed. They don't conform to modern standards of journalism, and they were just very difficult. And at that time, for those of those familiar with digitizing stuff in the early 2000s, there were products like Greenstone, and Olive was one where they did newspaper representation, those nice little, you could look at the article and it looked like a scrapbook if it continued on page 3, and it was just, but it was highly proprietary, and you could only look at the newspaper and the information contained in the newspaper as a newspaper. And the person I was working with, was someone that had worked with David Seaman at the E-Tech Center, and he said, Rachel, he goes, pardon me, he goes, but I don't understand why you have so much confidence and how you know how somebody's going to use this information 10 years from now. And why are you locking it down Why are you making it like a butterfly pinned to a board? Because you don't know how somebody's going to use this information. We need to make sure this information can be abstracted out from the container that it's in. You know, the person should be able to find all the information about housing prices, and they shouldn't have to know it came as an ad in a newspaper. They should be able to extract that out. I mean, this is early days. I mean, this is before everybody was talking about APIs and blah, blah, you know, and I'm like, what do you mean? What are we going to do? So we ended up just having multiple versions of these files of newspapers. I mean, we had raw text files in case somebody wanted to come through later and have some sort of computer algorithm to help us tag things. We did named entity tagging. We actually had files that came back from working with our partners at Tufts that had just as much metadata as original text. I mean, when you send off a file and it, you know, for example case, you know, it's only like 100 characters and it comes back as 500 characters because of the amount of metadata that somebody had put on it. I mean, that was extreme. That was metadata gone wild on some of these files. But this was someone that was in the early days of digital humanities, and they were doing things like named entity extraction and trying to track people across time. The good news about this story is that I went back to Richmond just a couple weeks ago and was talking to the folks in the Scholars Lab, and they're like, thank God you didn't, you know, make this file look like a newspaper, because they were recovering the data around missing slaves and recovery of slaves, and it's part of this whole emancipation database that they're doing. They're also extracting information about railroads. So being able to extract certain types of information, and the fact that we didn't lock it down, is actually informing a lot of digital humanities projects. An example, you know, another example of that, this is a screenshot from Chronicling America, that's really hard to say, which is the national newspaper digitization project in the U.S. That's a partnership with the Library of Congress and the National Endowment of the Humanities. This is the library view. You know, this is the curated gallery looking at newspapers as newspapers. When we see our collections as data, it looks like this. This is a scholar from Stanford that through the API pulled down all the newspaper data and is representing, there was a slider that I actually don't have on here when you have for days. When you can see the growth of newspaper publications, you can actually see publications by language. You can see how newspapers grew and distributed over time as America developed as a country. That, seeing our collections, our special collections, those things are unique to us as data that informs scholarship. Okay. Going back to freeing things up and a different type of open. So we talked about open as far as intellectual property. We talked about open as let's not lock things down as butterflies on a pinboard. But this is another type of open that I think sometimes we get as stewards of cultural heritage. I think for so many years, our libraries, archives, and museums were the safe place to keep things, that we had a social contract with the communities that we serve to maintain our cultural heritage for future generations. As the digital age is here and the networked age, we can digitize things and send things out into the wild, things that are in the public domain. But for some reason, because we've been these stewards for so long, and these items have been in our safekeeping for so long, we think we also have to clench down on these items once they're digital. In comes the Rijksstudio. And, you know, even though those items are technically in the public domain, okay? So the Rijksstudio is actually a project from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. They have released over 125,000 high-resolution images of the masterpieces in their museum open. You know, they just want to say, hey, it came from the Rijks. For anybody to do what you want. And Rijksstudio is actually this really nice space on the web where you can kind of see what people have done with these images, from having tattoos on their bodies to, you know, creating anything they want to do. And I think that's something that it's an unintentional consequence when we think about, I mean, because I know you've gone to archives and you've seen stuff that is in the public domain. The rights are, you know, it's there, it's free. You know, it should be out and inspiring our community. But when it's digitized, somebody has stuck a big watermark on it, or you have a low-resolution image, or you have to have this big paragraph of so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. You're like, really? Nobody's going to use that image. They're going to go somewhere else. Don't you want them to be at your cultural heritage organization? Don't you want them to inspire and be a part of your community? So this is my poster child for doing things right. And I'm not the only person that agrees that Will Knoll is doing things right. How many people know Will Knoll? Nobody. Okay, everybody, when you leave or you're hanging out at the airport, he does an awesome TED Talk. And just look it up, cue it up. I didn't put that link in here. Will Knoll not only is a Humanities Medal winner from the National Endowment of Humanities, but he also recently got recognized as a champion for change for science from the White House. This is somebody that has worked, he has a mathematics background, but his big project was the Archimedes Palimpsest, which is basically digitizing this very ancient work about mathematics. But what was awesome about it is that not only did they release the data that came off of this digitization project, as free and open, but it's machine readable. And I think that's the other thing that was touched on a couple times this week. We talked about having it exposed, but machine readable is a key piece. Heather, you talked about it a lot. It's something that by not committing to machine readable, we are actually less open, because we're not allowing that to be our documents to be part of the network. It's of the web. Well, also got recognized by the White House for, like I said, opening up data sets. And the other thing that he's well known for was his work at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. Baltimore's in my backyard, and Walters was always kind of this uppity art museum, very private. You had to pay a lot of money to go in. They had awesome collections. But it was just always, there was always this distance with the Walters. It was very proper, and you felt like elitist in a way. But Will was there, and they started digitizing all these crazy medieval manuscripts. Yeah, everybody loves medieval manuscripts, right? But he, once again, like the Rijksmuseum, put those images out as high-res images. They're definitely in the public domain for anybody to use. And it's really funny when he gives presentations, because he's like, I don't care if you put it on tea towels or coffee mugs, because people are going to know it comes from the Walters Art Gallery. And he goes, and look at my friends on Facebook. And let me tell you, the friends that are excited about the images that come from the Walters are not the people you expect. Teenagers. It's just amazing. By opening up the collection, they were able to touch a constituency they never could. And in fact, because they were able to open things up, that they no longer charge admission to go into the museum, they were able to cultivate these relationships and then get some development dollars by going to those individual donors that those collections, because they were open and accessible on the web, spoke to them. So they were able to change their business model as a result of opening their collections and having them on the web for people. Why am I telling you this? There's a recent report that came out, and it goes back to that whole idea of flipped library and focusing on those special collections and seeing our special collections as data. There's this report that came out, what was it, a month ago, maybe? A couple months ago, by Rick Anderson as part of the Ithaca SNR briefing about Can't Buy Us Love. And he talks about shifting priorities in our libraries to special collections, or what he calls non-commodity publications, as opposed to commodity publications, the things we buy from the big publishers and the things that are replicated across our libraries. And there are a lot of good points on there. There's some other points that, that get called into question. And if you want to see the conversation or the meta conversation around this, follow the hashtag on Twitter called Lovegate, and it's amazing. What I found was the conversation and what I learned about this particular concept. And the one point that Rick brought up in this report that actually, for the most part, he had me going along, special collections, what we should be paying attention to. And then he said, it allows us to sidestep the scholarly communication more. And I was like, all right, no. I'm like, what? Because just going back a few slides, when we look at our special collections as data, when we talk about how digital humanists use these things to do their scholarship, how we put our special collections online, the rights we assert on those actually translate, It's a representation of our values and our missions as librarians. When we talk about the mission of librarians being, facilitating knowledge creation in the communities we serve by having open access to knowledge, how we digitize our collections, how we represent them on the web, how we allow them to be machine readable, actually is an expression of how we feel about access and scholarly communication. Are people following this arc here? Okay. Sometimes when you're in your own head, you're like, oh, it makes sense to me. So, and this is where it kind of mashes up for me, because I tend to be in a lot of meetings about a lot of different topics. I hang out with people in archivists and talk about hidden collections and how they have to process this stuff. I hang out with my digital library folks, and we talk about digital collections and how we process things and get them out on the web and have them as data. And then I hang out with the research data and data curation people, and they're talking about big science data. And then here it is, research data as the new special collections, okay? That's when it was like worlds collide, because our special collections are the research data for our digital humanists. So this is our legacy stuff, our legacy collections. And here comes this new stuff coming in, this digital data. That's the research basis of the research and scholarly communication in our sciences and social sciences. So how we treat this stuff and the values and the mission we express and how we treat our special collections in the traditional sense should be in alignment with this new special collections with our research data. Is that kind of help coming together? All right. So what does this mean for our library organization, how we prioritize our work, how we spend our budget dollars? I don't have those answers, but I'm really looking for some leadership examples. And when I went out and looked around, I found this really great article that was actually, it's not an article, it was a transcript from a talk that Mike Furlow, he's an AUL at Penn State University, did. And it was an internal meeting, it was a local meeting about repositioning Penn State's special collections. And he talks about this coming together of research data, special collections, and his special collections. He talks about re-architecting the building, bringing in new people. This is somebody that's expressing this vision on a leadership level and setting the tone and allocating resources to see this is how the library is going. I wish more people were paying attention to this and what's happening at Penn State, because I think sometimes go, Penn State, it's the Cal School, what's going on there? But there's some really creative things coming from unusual places. And I love this picture. It's totally made up. This is like Photoshop before Photoshop. But the point I'm trying to make is we're at a moment in time that we really need to maybe stop and question what we're doing, because it's not the same thing anymore. What does it mean to do collection development? What does it mean to publish in libraries? What does it mean? Even like Jason and Scott's presentation yesterday, what does it mean to digitize a book? When you looked at the book as a container and then the delivery as the web, and I sat there and I was like, oh my God, if that applies to, I love the question about university press. I thought, this is a time to really rethink what we do, but be guided by, once again, the mission of librarianship, why we're here in the first place. Because I really think, as confusing and sometimes distracting, I know a lot of people say, oh, shiny, let's do this, But when we keep our mission in mind as professionals, I like to say the static kind of drops away and the path is there, of doing the right thing. And I'm not saying it's easy. It tends to be almost the most difficult thing. And I guess this is where I get to leadership. And I touched a little bit when I was referring to Mike. Not everybody has an opportunity to work for somebody that has this vision of where they see the library is going. And just my personal thought, I think a lot of, the network has changed everything. It's the time of the creatives. There's been a lot of books written about how, people used to have creative departments. Like if you wanted something over here, you went to the creative people that were all black and, But everybody has to be creative, right? And I love, and in this group, I think it's something that you all take for granted because it's that agile mindset. I mean, we saw that earlier this morning, that tight loop of learning about what was wrong with the product, building again, going out, that type of thinking and tolerance for risk and failure in a measured and balanced way. When we look at library administration, they come from a different time, in which we have a committee. We all learned that nothing kills innovation like a committee. So, let's have a committee, let's have a task force, let's wait 18 months, we'll write a report, and then we'll have this vision, and then we'll ask our people down here to enact the vision, and then we'll go on to something else. But I really think the aptitude for connecting strategy to action and operational practice is something that I see more in this community than I see in the administrative community. And I just think it's not a value judgment in any way. It's just a different skill set. And I think as a result, when I talk about leadership and the need for leadership, it's more of that quiet leadership. It's that leadership of seeing what needs to be done and doing the hard work, right? Being part of the big machine and doing your part in a way that benefits the whole community. This concept, and I think also pushing on our leaders in ways, these are the skills and the aptitudes that are in this community. So how do we, like I said, it's not a value judgment on an administrative level. It's just a skill they don't, for the most part, not everybody, that they don't have. So how do we assist in helping them understand concepts that I think, it's that whole story of the allegory of the cave. Sometimes people can't think that way or think that fast or have that tolerance for risk. And so how do we help minimize that? And there was a really good keynote given by Bethany Novisky at Code for Lib in Seattle. I want to say it was in 2011. I have a post to it. She wrote it all out. She always likes to write out her presentations, which is really great to go back. And she talks about two things I want to pull out really quickly. One is the concept of lazy consensus. And I think that was definitely a thread that we heard in the last couple days. Just do it. Once again, I'm picking on Heather. When she was talking the difference between AACR2 and RDA, she was like, AACR2 is rules and RDA is guidelines and guidelines and instructions. Well, shoot, you didn't call it a rule, it's guidelines. And guidelines, there's a little gray area around that. And I loved it when you said, if you just put a URI in that subfield, even though technically it wasn't supposed to be an identifier, but that little small action of civil disobedience could have such an amazing positive impact over the community. And I would definitely say that is one of those things that I would do until somebody told me to stop. And I think that's David Ferriero, who's the head of the National Archives in the United States. He always says, it's yes until somebody tells you no. Or the more roguish, it's easier to apologize and ask for permission. But, there's, be reasonable. Don't put on your black hat and ride out there. And Bethany goes through this whole thing around the constraints about lazy consensus. But because this community has the creative aptitude, and once again, that tolerance for risk, the tolerance for failure and trying over again, I'm definitely going to read this. She said, I wholeheartedly believe that software developers and system folks have the right mindset for the operational and philosophical method I'm advocating. You have the meticulousness, the deep practicality, the impulse to build and to maintain, the utter lack of ability to suffer fools gladly that positions you uniquely to make the needed contributions, not just to code, come on computer, but to the culture of libraries, and I want to say librarianship, and leadership. And we're working at a time when our institutions and our profession needs to move and not sit still. So this whole idea of a hacker epistemology was further explored by Beth Sadler at Code for Lib just this past year in Chicago. And once again, that's a really good thing to listen to again and again. She goes through about how this community has the problem-solving mindset, and that some of them might tell us the truth, but really the truth is what works for us. And this is a quote from Aleister Crowell, we solve for interesting. We are passionate about the work we do, and I love the advice, work on something you love. Because I really think, going back to the creatives, this is the time for the creatives. And we see this in our community already. We saw it this week with projects that people talked about and they were passionate about, like the Maker Bus. We see this about History Pen, Library Box, and Jason Griffey and his amazing Kickstarter campaign that got him $30,000. We see this in things like the project I was working on with Idea Drop. There's a lot of great, innovative work happening in our community. We need to share it a little bit more broadly. We have great conversations, but there's a risk here. I want to say there might be a fundamental flaw, because I was at a meeting and I happened to run into Michael Edson, who's the head of strategy and innovation at the Smithsonian Institution. I was telling him about my talk, and I was really excited about how this is the community to move librarianship forward because of all these great projects and all the good work that's being done. He's like, well, what about, how is incremental innovation going to get us to revolutionary change? Because there's the big frickin' wall. And I'm like, excuse me, I am not a wall, but he goes, it's this concept, which was part of a blog post by Kathy Sierra. And, we talk about libraries and the profession needs to change, and cultural heritage institutions, and, what I've been talking about already this morning. And we have all this great work going on. And it was like when he told me this, I stopped in my tracks. I'm like, you have totally ruined my talk, and I have to rethink about this. And I'm like, how do we get over this wall? How do we keep these individual instances of innovation and build on that momentum to move us to where we need to be? How do we scale the wall? So I have a couple thoughts on that. One of them is to get out of our own backyards. Our backyards are awesome. We have our games. We have people we know. We're comfortable. We talk the same language. But in order to leverage that momentum around innovation, around our ideas, we need to talk to other people. And I know you saw kids like this when you were growing up across the street. We need to be playing with them. I know they're kind of scary. They have play with sticks. But we need to get out there and have a little bit of courage of our own ideas, because our ideas are good and they make a difference. And I go back to that big slide. I mean, the one awesome thing about Jason Griffey and his Library Box Kickstarter campaign, I was talking to David about this the other night, was, he only wanted $3,000. And it was punted out on Kickstarter. It got picked up by Boing Boing, and he ended up with $30,000 for his idea. And what was awesome about it was the people that were investing in Library Box, most of them were not library people. It was the regular Joes. They realized the value of a good idea and were investing in it. So we need to go out and have that moment of courage and stick our neck out. The other strategy for getting over the big wall, so to speak, is this concept of connecting operational practice to strategic thinking. I tend to go to meetings where you have a lot of folks, and they talk about strategy. Once again, let's have a committee and do a report. And then they expect the magic to happen in this layer, and then it's all going to happen at their library, right? I mean, an example I like to pick up, a recent example, was the Office of Science Technology Policy out of the White House has this mandate about open access to research data and how all the federal funders have to comply. It has to be open, blah, blah, blah. So the publishers were like, and we have a solution. It's called Chorus. We're like, right? And then so ARL was like, wait, we have a solution. It's called Share. And all of us were it was at Open Repositories, and we're like, have you seen the Share document? Does anybody know who wrote that? Because it was like, strategy, SRU, SRW, OAI, they were conflating operational technical specs with strategy. And I know it was awesome that they did this. I'm not taking anything away from the organizations that put together SHARE. It is a strategic document, and I think they realized that they hadn't connected with the practitioner community in a meaningful way to understand how this was going to work in a programmatic way, right? I'm happy to say they've actually started talking to people in the practitioner community, and we're actually talking about what it's going to do to make this strategic vision work in a way that is meaningful. So what I'm trying to say is, your invitation to these meetings and these initiatives has gotten lost in the mail, all right? Just show up. I mean, a lot of things like the Lod Lamb Summit, just show up. It's open. DPLA, for us in America, this is one of these things that were like, I feel like every word of this project was debated ad nauseum to the point that was like, we're just having a meeting, we're digitizing stuff, and we hope it's going to help America and everybody else. But it was funny because people were like, well, I wasn't invited. And I'm like, it's an open meeting. They're here, and you can be there. Just show up and bring your A game and be wanting to be part of the solution. I think those are the things when we talk about initiatives around linked open data for libraries, archives, and museums. When I go to these meetings, the people that show up bring their best work, want to be part of the solution, and it's their passion. And I think that's the thing that gets us over the wall. You know, find that thing that's your passion. And yes, it's not part of your 40-hour-a-week job. It's never going to be. It's that thing that connects and makes you want to contribute to something greater than yourself. It goes back to this mission. It goes back to our social contract with our communities. It's being that integral part of a functional, democratic, small d society. John talked about this yesterday. You know, what are we doing? How does this connect to a greater social purpose? And for me, when he was doing his talk, I mean, it could have been a talk about the tool. I mean, it really could have, right? But he went in and talked about, I mean, I love that slide about the pluses and minuses of what History Pin was trying to do on a social framework, and I loved it was like reducing senior isolation. I'm like, I had never thought about that. And then I saw the Twitter stream going through about, hey, and how about we did this with this project? And that excitement, that passion is contagious. And that type of thing, when we go back to why we're here in the first place, why we're in this profession, about facilitating the creation of new knowledge in the communities we serve, being an integral part of a functioning democratic society, connecting with projects that inspire passion and can have a social purpose. That's why we're here. I know that's why I do my job. And it's not easy. Bethany put up an article yesterday on Facebook, and it talks about the loneliness of being that passionate person that's kind of out there on your own, doing something new, and, you know, kind of being between vulnerable and scared and, oh, this is awesome, am I here? You know, it's that lone wolf syndrome in a way, but wolves also travel in packs. So how do we still stay connected as a community? How do we encourage each other and play nicely? How do we bring out the best in each other? And I like to say, how do we dare greatly? And this is a work that was done by Brené Brown. And just really quickly, I'm going to let her talk because she does it a little bit more elegantly than me.
Critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and blood and sweat, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I know that there's a myth that vulnerability is weakness, but it's not. To show up, to let ourselves be seen, to try, to put ourselves out there when we're not sure if we're going to succeed, that's vulnerability, and that's daring greatly. And For me, this book is about what it takes to bust through the fear of not being enough, of not being perfect enough, of not being bulletproof enough, the fear of failing. You know, I used to have the question that used to guide my life is, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And since I wrote Daring Greatly and since I came across this quote, my new question is, what's worth doing even if I fail?
I like that. What's worth doing even if I fail? So, all that warm fuzziness aside, I guess the thought I want to leave with you today is that the reason why I spend my time in the practitioner community is because I believe in you guys. And I really think that you have the skills and the abilities, the talent, and the knowledge to move our profession forward. So it's really up to you on whether or not what you do with this challenge. It is up to you to own this responsibility and play your part in it. And as anybody knows who has a conversation with me, I'm like, yeah, that's great. What are you doing? I want more. I want more from you guys. It's not good enough just to do something in your own backyard. You really have to stretch a little bit more and have a broader impact. And we need to do it now. So that's it. This is the end of Access, unless you guys have some other questions. But thank you for your time today and for allowing me to be here.